I'm Christy Dosh. I am a sports business reporter and professor, a recovering attorney, and I consult with College Sports Solutions on a number of issues around college athletics. I am joined by Jeff Schemmel, the founder and president of College Sports Solutions. Jeff has more than 3 decades of leadership across college athletics. He's served as an athletic director and in key leadership positions with the NCAA, as well as several conferences. He currently consults with athletic departments in areas such as strategic planning, executive searches, operational reviews, naming rights negotiations, and gender equity. We've also got another former AD with us, John Hartwell. John is a partner and a consultant at CSS and has nearly 30 years of NCAA Division I leadership experience. As I said, he's a former athletic director at multiple FBS institutions and also combines his financial acumen as a CPA with a strong track record in coaching hires, facilities development, and sustainable program building. And we had to get a coach on with us today because we're going to deep dive into the land of general managers today. Chris Kleiman is joining us today. He most recently served as the head football coach at Kansas State University for 7 years. Taking over for legendary coach Bill Snyder, Kleiman compiled a 54-34 record in 7 seasons at Kansas State and previously won 4 FCS championships at North Dakota State. So we've got athletic directors, we've got a coach, and we're going to talk about the guys who aren't in the room with us right now, the general managers. Talk behind their backs just a little bit about what their jobs look like, how they got their jobs, and where we think that role is going. For those of you who are here live, feel free to drop questions in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on those. If it makes sense to kind of slip them into the conversation we're already having, I will do that. Otherwise, I will get to as many of them as I can at the end here today. So I want to kick this off with talking a little bit about all of the new job titles we've seen come into college sports, especially with the advent of revenue sharing. We sort of started with general managers, but I looked down a list somebody had of all the people in GM type roles, and I saw chief of staff, director of player personnel, director of player acquisition, chief football strategy officer. I mean, people were getting creative with the job titles, but are they really different jobs or are they just different titles for the same job? I thought I'd start with you, Chris. We talked about this a little bit before we came on live with everybody. Tell us a little bit about what goes on behind the scenes in terms of these job titles.
Well, I think it's a new landscape with the advent of the transfer portal and rev share and NIL, and I think everybody was finding out that the coaches couldn't do that as well as run a day-to-day operation of coaching. So they ended up hiring a general manager, and then the general managers then started to think of it as a front office for the NFL, started filling front office jobs that had really nothing to do with the daily grind of a football coach, and you needed to have some separation so that you may have not only was it director of player personnel and acquisition, but college scouting, high school relations or high school based recruiting, and then junior college recruiting, and then portal recruiting. And I know there's groups of or schools that have maybe 7 or 8 guys totally on the side of looking at the guys that are going to maybe go in the portal. And trust me, everybody knows who's going in the portal by mid to late October. Then there's another group of guys that are just looking at the junior college guys. Another group of guys that are just looking at the high school recruiting. And I think everybody was just trying to get as many titles as they could to just increase their staff size so that they could have enough boots on the ground to answer all those questions.
And
Jeff and John. Oh,
yeah,
I was just going to ask you guys from the AD seat, what do you think this looks like?
well, and I would just add a comment or two to what Chris said. I think every institution is different. Every head coach is different. Every AD is different. So they look at things a little bit differently, and it depends on the amount of resources that you have at your disposal. What's your budget? How can you fit all of that into what you want to accomplish? So, and that's why I think we get so many different positions and titles that are coming out that fit into whatever scenario, whatever budget situation you have at your particular institution could be, and it could be some even titles that fit into a hierarchy that you've already established.
Yeah, and just to add to what both Chris and Jeff have said, I wouldn't get hung up in the title as much because it varies from institution to institution. Probably the GM having the oversight of most of those folks. But again, as we talked, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about in this next hour, is hey, what exactly is the GM overseeing? What is the head coach overseeing? Is the head coach truly overseeing the GM? I mean, again, there are so many different models. There are about as many models as there are schools out there because everybody does it a little different.
We're definitely going to dive into what does the org chart look like or what should it look like? Because we're seeing some different things at different schools. I wanted to start kind of with who fits this GM profile? We're seeing really different backgrounds. I know I've interviewed GMs who came from more of a statistics based background. I know one I talked to, he was just running his own website where he was breaking down all sorts of stats, I think just basketball, and he's a basketball GM now. And he was sort of discovered that way by a mid-major school and is now at a Power Four school, just solely based on this website he had built out versus we have GMs like I'm a Gator. I teach at University of Florida. We just got Dave Caldwell, who's been in professional sports, and we've seen quite a few pro sports hires. Can we talk through a little bit like the pros and cons of somebody who has pro sports experience versus somebody coming from college sports or more of a stats-based background? I don't know which one of you wants to kick us off. Who has a strong opinion about that one?
I'm going to let Chris go there first.
You know, I've seen it all. I've seen the pro sports side come into it, and I think it's a great thing. And then they got to learn the college game because whether there's a salary cap, so to speak, there is with the rev share, but there's not with NIL. There's a statistical side of it. There's a coaching side of it. Do you want somebody that has been involved in coaching before? But I know this: whoever that GM is, and I think John had said it that there's no specific cookie cutter way of doing it. But if I have a really good experience in the player personnel side of it and not as much in the statistical side of it, I've got to find somebody to bring in that can help me in the stats side of it. I've got to find somebody that can help me in the negotiating side of it. That's probably the biggest piece that's going on right now is you've got to have a kind of a chief negotiator because that's the person that's going to spend as much time of finding out if these contracts are or real or these numbers are real that they can make a deeper dive and say, hey, are you really offering this kid 400,000 because we think his value is 250. What's your value? Your value is what somebody's going to spend on you. And so whether or not they come from the professional ranks, which I know is starting to become a thing, they're still going to try to feed their staff with some of the experiences that they may not have.
And I think in most cases, and Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but in most cases, these GMs, each of them has a pot of money that they can distribute among wherever you're going, whether it's high school, whether it's the portal, whether it's keeping your own guys. And they've got to manage that pot of money. Some schools is $1 million and some is the full $21 million. So it really becomes, how does that GM manage, and the communication line between that general manager and the head coach and the AD in many cases is critical to that because there's got to be a philosophy about how you're going to attack it.
Yeah, I guess the thing I'd say about that is because there is no cap, because 20.5 million is not a cap anymore. There are no guardrails. So what that GM may be doing is contacting whatever donors he can to try to get more money in that NIL space until we get some regulations on that. And that's the frustration that a lot of us coaches have is not everybody's dealing with the same amount of money. Everybody's all over the map on that. And, the really good ones are going to go find as many donors as they can to get that thing up to $45 million on it from a football side of things. And that's the thing I think that everybody's trying to figure out until we get some guardrails of what that number is going to be and maintained. I think that's what makes this role so difficult.
Is that maybe somewhere where somebody with a pro background it might be a little more difficult. They're not used to having to go fundraise from donors or having to deal with third-party collectives and, coordinate efforts with them. So that seems to me like maybe you need somebody on your team from that college background who understands that side of it.
You need fundraisers is what you need.
Yeah.
That's the other thing is you're really looking for somebody who can be a chief fundraiser for you, and work with the whatever that university's athletic endowment is, or athletic promotions and donors are, to say, hey, I don't want to go visit with this guy if you're trying to get him for a building fund, but I'm going to go get these three guys because they're not going to go for buildings. They want to help spend money on athletes. And I think that's the tricky part right now is there's some schools that have that billionaire that can fund everything. And then there's other schools that are scratching, year to year trying to raise that 20 million. Well, if you're trying to raise that 20 million, but you just needed a new basketball arena, or you have something in place to get a new football stadium or a renovation, where's the give and take there? It's just like the staffing size. If I can go get 6 more staff members or at 100,000, or get 6 more players at 100,000, as the coach, I'm going to go try to fight for the 6 players at 100,000, where the GM saying, no, we need more help. We're going to spend the money there.
And part of the challenge from a management standpoint, whether you're the athletic director or the head coach, is who is controlling the communication with the prospective player, student athlete. Because the other component here is whether it's Learfield or JMI or anybody else who may have your third party rights and your corporate sponsorship rights, they've got a piece to the pie in some of these bigger deals. The donors from the collective side have a piece in there, and then obviously through rev share too. And the rev share component is the easiest part because it's primarily just dealing with the institution. But when you get into the collective, is it the executive director of the collective or one of their representatives, or is it a donor who is funding a significant portion of the collective and they feel like they have the right to communicate directly with the prospective student athlete? Or is it the corporate sponsor or a Learfield representative? So what was intended, I think, to try to clear the picture a little bit has just further muddied it.
And I think that's where the CSC comes in, and yes, there are parameters that have been put around NIL, and they're supposed to be the police that really do look at it and either okay it or don't. But they have no enforcement capability. It's been frustrating, I know, for people like Coach Kleiman, when there's no parameters. There are parameters, but nobody's enforcing those parameters, and that's the difficulty.
Go back to sort of the org chart idea a little bit. Jeff and John, I want to ask you guys from the AD seat. Okay, we start hiring these new roles. What's the involvement of, say the AD or someone else higher up on the admin side versus the coach in who's getting hired into these roles? Because sometimes we see a GM who's specific to one sport. I'm guessing you would involve the coach more there. But some GMs are covering multiple sports, or they're an overall GM for the department, especially when we get outside of the Power Four. What do you think that looks like in terms of who's leading the charge on this hiring?
I think if it's done the appropriate way, at the end of the day, the athletic director, which is at most places where the buck stops in terms of if there's an institutional control issue, anything like that, it stops in the lap of the athletic director. So I think there's got to be at least a final sign off from an athletic director. Obviously, if it's a GM for football, the head football coach has to be the driving force behind that. And again, we talked about what's happened at Cal and what's happened at Stanford. Is the athletic director, is the football coach reporting to the GM or vice versa? And how does that report to the athletic director? But again, I know this goes back to the traditional way of doing things, but I think from an institutional control and management within the athletic department that the AD has got to give the final approval on that position.
And I think as you see more and more, and I'm going to call them general managers, but many times they're chiefs of staff under an athletic director that will manage the GMs, because you're seeing GMs in football and basketball now, specific to sports and maybe even some other sports. So I think if there is someone over top of all that, that's what an AD is probably looking for with his or her GM or chief of staff to manage all of those underneath, whether you call them GMs or not.
Yeah, and that specific person needs to have a great relation with the compliance office so that they can work with that compliance director on the NIL Go piece. You don't want to have too many chefs in the kitchen on that. You just want to have it as one person for what we had in football that went directly to the compliance office to say, here's what we have. What are your concerns? Did it get through NIL Go? And if there are any issues, I think there's the fewer people you have involved in that, the better. But then, I communicated with our AD on a weekly basis from a football standpoint, and our GM communicated with our athletic director from a rev share NIL piece on a weekly basis, because he knew more about that, especially when you're talking in October, November, when a lot of this stuff is happening. And that's the thing that I don't think a lot of people realize in football. A lot of these agents and players are making determinations from October 15th on through Thanksgiving if they're going to leave and what schools are interested. Coaches don't have time for that. So it's the GM and that personnel department that are not only figuring out if that player is a fit. I know they're not in the portal, but we all know that that's the reality of it right now, is the agents are driving the portal by saying, I know this kid's out there or is going to be out there come January 4th, and I'm going to put his name out there to these GMs so that they can get the investigation going on him to see, or the evaluation going on, I'd say, to make sure that number is what that kid deserves.
And I gave advice to an athlete this year who was trying to decide about going in the portal, and he had an agent, but we just happened to be having a conversation about it. And I said, if nobody's shown any interest yet, I don't know if you should put your name in the portal, because I sort of feel like if there was going to be interest, you'd already know about it. And we've seen so many men and women get left in the portal and not picked up anywhere. And now they've given up their spot at their original school. They didn't get picked up. And I don't, some numbers have floated around out there, but I don't feel like the NCAA has fully advertised just how many guys and girls are ending up with no home after the portal. And I kind of feel like if you haven't already been having discussions, I don't want to, encourage people to break rules, but if you haven't been getting any interest before the portal, I don't know if you're going to get any once you get in there.
And Christy,
Oh,
that's what's so sad. That's what's so sad, Christy, is it's a third party person that's telling that young man or young woman, get in the portal. I'll make sure there's plenty of traffic for you. And then when that traffic's away, not likely do many schools take kids back. That's tough on a locker room to say, wait a minute, you went in the portal, you were there for a week to 2 weeks to 3 weeks to 4 weeks, whatever. And then that you want to come back. And I know from a coaching standpoint, it always frustrated us to see I'm re-signing with the program. What do you mean? You've always been with that program. What are you re-signing for?
yeah.
It's not. This isn't the NFL where you're re-signing because your contract ended.
Chris, who on the staff? This makes me think of something that came up in another GM webinar I did. I had the assistant football GM from Stanford on with me, and he was talking about how at Stanford, part of his job had become watching how many classes the athletes were taking, because they would load up on classes over the summer and in spring semester, because really they were trying to graduate early because they want that Stanford degree. Most of them are not willing to transfer and leave without that Stanford degree, but they do want to go somewhere else. And so they're stacking these overloads of classes to graduate early to still have eligibility to go play somewhere else during their master's degree. And I had that conversation with somebody at Duke too, kind of watching what people were doing that might be those early signals they're looking to transfer. Where do you think that falls? Who needs to be keeping an eye on that?
Yeah, it's huge. And there are people keeping an eye on it, because the one thing that I think a lot of the older kids that have gone in the portal don't realize, because it's just hey, I'm going talking to an agent, I'm going in the portal, let's see what my value is, and so on and so forth. Nobody says to that young man, how many hours are you away from graduating, or are you graduated, or what year are you in your academia? Because I've seen a lot of kids that are going in the portal and don't have a degree, but they're not going to meet progress towards degree at the next institution.
Right.
And so now they're really in trouble because they're already, we all know who's going in the portal even before the portal opens. And you're like, wait a minute, you're 17 hours from a degree. What are you doing? Because if you go to another school, they may not have your degree. Or if they put you in a different degree, you now may be 45 hours away. And that's the sad part of it is we're losing the track of the fact that the number one thing these kids need to do is get a degree. I know they're making money, but that's going to end at some point. We've got to make sure they get degrees. And I know there's a lot of kids that probably have had to pay for an extra semester or 2 semesters because they got in not knowing how close they were to a degree and then didn't meet progress towards it.
And I want to add to what Chris said there, because, and I've said this many, many times, in the 90s, particularly when we were on campuses, the big word, the media was all over us about not graduating our kids. And it became a huge cry across the country. And that led to the things that Chris is talking about, progress toward degrees, what you had to get to every year to make progress toward a degree. Do we hear anything from the media or anyone else about that, the educational piece of this, or graduating your kids? No one talks about it anymore. And that's very frustrating for me.
And somebody put in our questions, I wonder how many schools will be caught in violation of PTD in their next NCAA audit by saying someone is at 80% at the new school.
Yep.
Well, and I'm wondering, who is watching this? Do you have any idea, Chris? Is it the GM, or what role is sort of keeping an eye on who might be entering the portal?
Well, I think it's everybody in your department, to be honest with you. I mean, I met with a group of people on a weekly basis, from athletic training to nutrition to equipment to our GM to strength and conditioning, everybody but coaches, because those people hear an awful lot of things. They hear somebody getting taped saying, I can't wait to get out of here. I only got 3 more weeks left, to, did you see so and so? And that's still the frustration about some of the financial part of it. Did you hear so and so is getting paid X amount of dollars? Man, I'm out of here if I don't get paid close to that. May not be the right number, but that's just the rumors going on. So we met a lot to talk about it, and to say, okay, especially once you got to about the 1st of November, when you knew you're on the last handful of weeks of the season, you can tell. And then you're looking as well. Hey, did he pick up an 8-week course? Oh, shoot, he picked up 2 8-week courses, trying to maybe get done. Hey, when's that kid graduating? I didn't know when everybody graduated, but I had a pretty good gauge of that kid's really close. And so it was somebody within that front office piece, not the coaching staff, somebody in that front office piece.
Yeah, and
That leads me into. Go ahead,
sorry.
John.
I was just going to say that's an area that your academic staff used to keep the pulse on, but right now you have such a high turnover percentage in your roster every year, that it's all they can do just to process the newcomers in and the folks departing out, and they really don't have the ability to keep up with that anymore. But Chris is spot on. If you really want to know the pulse of what's going on, talk to the training room and the equipment room, because that's where guys let their guard down.
And the strength and conditioning staff.
Yep.
Yep.
100%. And that's the thing that we're forgetting about, those people and the academic staff, that all of a sudden you're trying to get a transfer kid and you need to get that transfer evaluated 2 days ago, and you just get it, and that academic staff's got to get the write up on it as fast as you can. And well, that's not one kid. You may be asking them to do that for 30 kids. And all of a sudden, the whole month of January, every Saturday and every Sunday, you've got your athletic training staff in coming to evaluate the recruits that are coming in. The strength coaches can't have that Sunday off. They're the hardest working people on your staff. Hey, you need to come in and meet these recruits. The coaches, that's their world. But some of the support staff, those are the people that I'm afraid are going to say, the heck with this business. I'm going to go into private something because I can't get a moment to breathe because I'm always either hosting a recruit or evaluating a transcript or calling a training staff to ask about this kid that's transferring. And that's where we've got to get a better calendar, bottom line.
And Chris just touched on in the many university clients and athletic department clients we have these days, the biggest cry is the amount of athletic trainers and medical people that are leaving the athletic department and they can go make twice as much money and work 9 to 5, 5 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
I have a brother-in-law who was a strength and conditioning coach in college sports his whole career, and he left and went to a private facility that's run by a big healthcare company. And his wife was a D2 assistant conference commissioner, and she has left college sports now too. So these discussions happen in our family all the time about what's asked in those roles and the hours that they keep, and the money they make compared to the number of hours they're working. So I think you're right. There's a lot of people that are overstretched. Speaking of staffing, we got a question as I was advertising this webinar on social media the other day about how all these new staff members, general manager, director of player acquisition, whatever we're calling people in their assistant roles, how does that fit in with the traditional roles that we already had? And I know we're talking a lot about football, and that's because we have Chris here today, but how do you sort of integrate that with the staff you already have in terms of who's in charge of, especially different parts of recruiting, and now with the transfer portal being on top of that, how do you divide those job duties and get everybody sort of doing the thing that they're best at?
John, take that one.
Yeah, that is really a challenge for today's athletic directors and chiefs of staff because you've got the financial constraints, and it's whether you're at Ohio State or Texas or whether you're at, Appalachian State or Georgia Southern. Everybody says, "Hey, we've got to be able to become more efficient in what we're doing." And it's really not about efficiency at a lot of places. It's about what is the bottom line that we can push from an expenditure number for staffing potentially to rev share. That's the bottom line. So everybody is looking at those things. And when you've got that on a staff side, on an administrative staff side, and then the coaching staff wise, and again, we talked about the nomenclature of these positions before, regardless of what you call it, trying to grow those staff numbers, there creates a challenge, a division there within the department that, quite frankly, comes down to the athletic director to manage. And, as the AD, you've got to say, hey, we've got to all pull together here. And what gives us the best opportunity to have success? What gives us the best opportunity to win? But it is a daily challenge in a lot of athletic departments. If you talk to athletic directors, they are managing those types of situations on a daily basis.
And I would just echo very quickly what John just said. He took the words out of my mouth. The job description for an AD today is so much different than when I was an AD, and that wasn't that long ago. But with the advent of NIL and rev share and all of what's going on around it and attached to it, the communication between an AD and staff and coaches is much different and even more important than it ever was.
But I think we've seen a lot of athletic directors who are maybe getting close to retirement age just going ahead and retiring. I feel like I've seen more retirements the last couple of years than previously. It would be a tough
Yep.
thing to wrap your head around at the tail end of your career.
All I know is all of my old colleagues and friends in the AD business, if they're still in the chair, they're not having any fun.
We've got some really good questions coming in from people that I'm going to sort of integrate here because it's the topics we're talking about. Chris, we got one for you. They want to know, how did you split the roles of GM, Chief of Staff, and Director of Football Operations?
Um, I wanted the GM to be a part and in charge of all the recruiting side of things, and then have him end up hiring somebody to help with the transfer portal. And that ended up being 3 or 4 people that were just in charge of the transfer portal. And then we had another couple people that were just in charge of high school recruiting, high school relations, because that's the area that gets lost the most is in high school. And then the football operations, I had separate from them that just worked with me with logistics of practice times to travel schedule, and kind of had them separate. But then we had another one that was kind of the recruiting liaison that would set up official visits, in season, out of season, unofficial visits, and that's where we were continuing to try to hire more and more and more, because we needed another one in transfers. We needed another one in high school. We needed a junior college one. And to what Jeff and John are saying, it's hard for me because I'm going to the athletic director saying, hey, we need 2 more spots. He's like, what do you mean? We just hired 3 last year.
Yeah.
Well, we need 2 more to keep up, because we're going to end up having to take 20 kids in the portal, because you kind of know what you're going to end up having to look for. We need 20 kids in the portal, and that's 600 kids you're going to look at to try to get 20. And so we need to have, 2 guys on offense, 2 guys on defense, maybe a specific guy for O-line. So you're trying to hire these people that can evaluate. So they had to have some coaching background, but be able to call and ask about kids. But that's the challenge right now. And that's the tricky part, is these kids aren't in the portal when this is going on. And that's where we've got to get some guardrails to this thing, because everybody is being recruited when there's no portal yet. Everybody announced they were going in the portal in after their season. We all knew they were going in November, and now they can't even visit a place till January 3rd when the portal opened up. And sure enough, January 3rd, I'm committed to this school, committed to this school, committed to this school, or I'm just entering no contact. Well, then there was tampering. And so that's the thing that all of us are just trying to get as many employees as we could to try to keep up with which was an area you really had a hard time keeping up with.
Those people you mentioned who were sort of dedicated to the transfer portal, maybe this is a dumb question, but what are they doing sort of like from this time of year through, the season starting? What would their duties be now when the portal's done? And we obviously don't know who's going to enter yet for next year. What happens during this period?
Yeah, I think the first thing is you look at every kid that you've recruited the last 3 years and track them. And that's a lot of kids. Whether or not you had them on an official visit, maybe a smaller number. Had them on an unofficial visit, maybe a much, much bigger number. And you get a database of where all those kids are at, and maybe you watch whatever film that you have on those kids. And then the sad thing is, you probably look at the kids that most recently went into the portal and went to a school, because most likely those guys are going to leave after another year anyway. Yeah. And you didn't, if a kid had been at a school for 2 or 3 years, you probably didn't track them anymore. But you wanted to track the people that you knew because you recruited them or had them on campus, or the people that left a school, went to another school with multiple years left, because chances are they're not going to be happy at that school, or the agent's going to make sure that, okay, we got the buck out of that place. Now let's go get the next dollar out of the next place.
Which I got to ask Coach a question here, because we're on the subject, but the tampering thing, obviously a lot of noise and attention to Clemson right now and what Dabo's saying about being tampered with his kids. What's your thought there? Is it as prevalent as we seem to think it is?
Yeah, it is. And I haven't followed all of that story. I'm good friends with Dabo, so I'm gonna leave that be. But it's very prevalent. And the sometimes if there's coach to coach stuff, that we've got to get that cleaned up, and I know that happens. But the tampering is really more, in my opinion, an agent calling your GM to say, Jeff Schemmel's entering the portal. Get him on your evaluation board right now. Well, we're evaluating him. Is that really tampering? I don't know. But if we tell the agent, hey, we really like Jeff, let him know that if he enters, we'll have a spot for him. That goes on all over the place. And so then that agent calls that player and says, I reached out to 7 GMs and they'd all take you if you went in the portal. That's tampering, but nobody really talked to the guy. It's no different than, the coach that doesn't visit with the athletic director, but the agents visit back and forth. Have you talked to that school? No, I haven't talked to that school. Next thing you know, they're the head coach at that school. So they're just doing it. The agents are just doing it for coaches like they do for players. I don't think is that tampering? I don't know. It's the way of the world right now. That's why we got to get some guardrails.
Yep.
Christy, just to follow up on the question you asked, Chris, about what are the portal guys doing now that the portal has closed. Here's a conversation that's happening at a lot of the group of six leagues, as well as even in Division 2 and 3 ranks, is you have athletic directors and coaches who are scared to death about having their kids. I mean, it's crazy, but they're scared to death about having their kids, especially the younger, freshmen, sophomores, being named to second and third team, all conference teams, much less first team, because all that is doing is putting further emphasis on those young men and women for the transfer portal. And so there is a ton of due diligence that happens now, even though, we're 11 months from the portal opening back up, that is being done. And that's to the detriment of the kids. I mean, to not recognize success because you're scared of losing those individuals from your institution, the tail is wagging the dog in a lot of these scenarios.
That is 100% accurate. And that's another reason on another conversation about not having the athletes as employees. Because if I'm an employee and I get a $50,000 raise for being on a first or second team all conference, do you want to save that money by not pushing their name forward? But if they're deserving of it, you got to get them on there, and then they could get paid for that. And that's the issue with having them as employees.
Got a related question here. An anonymous person here asked, what is the optimal calendar from your point of view? The current system is awful, both from an academic and entertainment perspective.
From a coach's point of view, there is not a great answer to this right now. There really isn't, because I've been on the AFCA Board of Trustees and we've looked at every different angle of this thing. When I step back as not a coach right now, this is not a perfect scenario, but I'd almost rather push it to April now.
Mm-hmm.
And then eliminate spring ball. There are no such thing. And if you want to make it an NFL model, then make it an NFL calendar and let the guys go all through December. You don't have kids opting out of bowl games and stuff. You don't have kids leaving their team and stuff, and you get them through all December. The problem with this model, though, is then they might be leaving, and you got them in school January, February, March, and April before they finish that academic semester. Let them go get in the portal on April 30th, have all the stuff we had in January, the month of May, and then do OTAs in June, like the NFL does, and then you start your training camp. I know that the pushback on that is, what are we doing with these kids January, February, March, and April when they're not going to be on your football team? There's not a great answer to that, other than the fact of you're getting them an extra semester academically so that maybe they could be eligible or maybe get a degree. I mean, that's still, like we talked about, that's still the goal of this thing, is to get them a degree. But that's the issue with that model of the end of April, is what are we doing with them second semester?
Okay, another related one we got is somebody that's curious regarding how offers and contracts are being made. Who authorizes the final contract, or who's negotiating? I'm sure this looks different from one school to the next, but what are some of the models we've seen for that?
Well, I'm gonna go there first because when Chris was talking about this, it made me think of one that's fairly close to home to me, but it's catching a lot of attention. My son, deputy AD at Tulane, and they lost their quarterback, Derek Mensa, to Duke 2 years ago after a great freshman year. He signed a 2-year contract at Duke with reportedly at least $2 million a year, and now has apparently breached that they've settled it, I think, but breached that contract with Duke, and now is going to head to Miami and play quarterback at Miami. And so again, it goes back to Chris's discussion about how do we enforce. I mean, that is a legal contract that he would have signed for a 2-year deal at Duke, and for that now to end up as it is, and I'm sure there is some compensation that's going back to Duke in some way. But at the end of the day, what are the parameters? What's the enforceability for even a legal contract in this regard? And the craziness that's surrounding the free agent, NFL And NBA people have contracts that are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. In college athletics, everything's 1 year, it appears, and they're free agents every dang year.
Well, and we saw this at Washington this year too with their quarterback saying he was leaving. He's ended up going back, but he had just signed the new contract. And, I think it was days old when it seems like he changed his mind, and now he's ended up back at Washington, which seems like it would be an awkward situation when you made national news that you were going to leave, and then a few days later you're going back. That seems awkward with your teammates, awkward with your coaches. I don't know what that looks like practically, but Jeff, you and I have had this conversation before. I've talked to GMs who don't have experience prior to this negotiating contracts, who, aren't lawyers or haven't been agents, but who are being tasked by their athletic departments with negotiating these contracts. And frankly, it scares me in some instances because athletes bring me their contracts. I don't represent anybody as an attorney, but athletes will drop into my DMs and they'll say, "Hey, what does this mean?" Because they don't all have agents or they don't all have experienced agents. And, no one really knows what can be enforced in these contracts and what can't. I don't know either. I can't give them a good answer, but I can say, look, this is this is what I believe you're agreeing to, and is this something that you can live with? But a lot of times that person that they're negotiating with on the other side is learning their way through this too.
But the contracts don't have any bite to them, and that's part of our concern right now. And I'd say the same thing on the coaches side of it. There's buyouts on that side. That's where the rev share number, if it was solidified at that 20.1 and that's all people had to work with, then you wouldn't be able to buy somebody out of a contract because you'd be taken into that pool. Yep. But because we have no guardrails, we'll buy that out with somebody else just writing a check, and we'll still pay this kid whatever he wants and more, because I don't have to worry about holding myself to the 73% of football that may get of the 20 million because I've got 40 million or 35 million, and I'll just have somebody write a check probably to say, yeah, let this thing, make sure this goes away, and now we can pay that kid double or triple. You wouldn't be able to do that if you had everybody locked into that rev share number.
The Duke thing's interesting because, from everything I've heard, through back channels, I do think Duke is getting money out of that. How much it is remains to be seen, but I've heard 2 million quite a few times now. So let's just pretend it's 2 million. I have we can't corroborate that with anything, but let's just pretend for the sake of this conversation that it's 2 million. The NCAA's Q&A that came out after the House settlement said that if another school pays a buyout, it counts against their rev share cap. So, yep. But this is the question that comes up is it going to count against Miami's cap if they say this was a $2 million thing, but did they pay it, or really is it just coming out of the money that they paid to Mensa, or where is it coming from, and how do we decide whether it counts against the cap or not?
Third party is where it comes from. So
I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly right.
So Christy, let's take that even a step further as you look at NCAA financial reports. Does that $2 million that's going to Duke, and my initial blush, I would say that's unrelated business income tax. I mean, that's something that's clearly not in
the CPA,
not in the realm of typical revenue streams for an athletic department. So it causes a bunch of unintended consequences, I believe.
Can you explain to people what it means? Because I bet a lot of people don't really understand that.
Yeah,
I barely understand it because I've reported on it once.
Yeah, so a lot of times you hear people calling it UBIT, unrelated business income tax, but it is money that is generated that is outside of ticket sales or corporate sponsorship. There's a lot of components, the typical revenue streams, and it's not as prevalent as it was, but the IRS has always kind of kept an eye on that. And even though athletic departments are, quote, not for profit, this has been subject to tax. It's not just athletics. It's any auxiliary area within a university that could be subject to that. So. Sorry, I didn't mean to geek out to the numbers there for a minute.
Glad we've got a CPA. We got 2 lawyers and a CPA and a coach. So we can solve all the problems.
Chris is the only common sense guy amongst all of us.
He's the only normal guy in this group.
One other question that we got, I still got a few of my own, but we're getting great questions from the folks here. You guys can continue to drop those in and I'll get them answered. Doug asked, he said, since all of this seems to be moving towards the pro model, free agency with the transfer portal, college scouting, transfer high school scouting, etc., does that mean that the next generation of ADs will come out of a pro sports background instead of a college athletics background? So we've talked a lot about GMs coming from the pro background, but do you think we're going to start seeing athletic directors more coming from that pro background?
Well, I'll go first there. I think you're seeing that already. I think you're seeing we used to call them non-traditionals, and we used to roll our eyes a little bit because there was so much to learn about our business in college athletics that coming in from the outside and not knowing our business was that you're behind the eight ball right out of the gate. And now I think there's because we're starting to resemble professional sports so much more, especially at the highest levels, especially at the Power Four and in many cases the Group of Six level. I think presidents are looking at, shoot, I got to find a guy that can manage the resources, period. That can not so much fundraise, I don't think, as manage the resources and figure out the revenue sources. And you can hire your fundraisers, but I think at the end of the day, you're going to see more of that, Christy.
Yeah, I would agree with Jeff on that. And, I think there's a part of that that's good, the business side of it. But I also think that there's a fine line there about being transaction based versus relationship and people based. And I think, but I know there's some aspiring athletic directors watching in today. I think you've got to balance those two areas. You've got to understand the business side of it. But I would hate to see this business lose the people side of things. But when you look at the transfer portal, that's part of it. When you've got a new roster every year, and you have very few kids who you see come in as bright-eyed freshmen who think they've got all the answers, and they get knocked on their tail a few times, and then learn through experience and battle back and have successful careers regardless of the sport. And then they graduate and go on. They may go on to professional athletics, or they go on to a successful business career, be an outstanding mom or dad, or all of those things. I think that is some of the tie that has endeared our fan bases and our donors over the years that's being lost a little bit. I don't know that you can put that genie back in the bottle, but I think there's still a place out there for those kids who can do that, that they're going to be forever endeared by their alma maters and their donors and alums.
And I would add one more thing to that, and I still believe this. Maybe I'm too old school, but I think still for an athletic director, the most important decisions they'll ever make are the coaches they hire. And if you're bringing in somebody that's, yeah, they might have NFL experience, but not in hiring coaches. And ADs are talking about not just football coaches, but basketball and volleyball and softball and baseball and track and field, all of the sports. And I think again, it's the most important hat they'll ever wear is hiring great coaches.
I want to, what we've talked about, I think applies a lot to Power Four institutions that might have, a GM and assistant GM, seven different roles, 10 different roles just on football that sort of deal with this new reality we're living in. But what about if we kind of zoom out to the group of five, group of six, whatever we're calling them now, into smaller schools who maybe aren't able to hire individual GMs for each sport, and maybe they've got one GM, handling several sports or all of the sports. How do you think the GM role looks different and will evolve at that level where you don't have the same budget to have as many, as many different folks in those roles?
Well, and I'll use another personal example. My younger son is the athletic director at the University of South Dakota, and they don't have the resources to hire a GM. And they are trying to figure out with the existing staff how they especially divvy up responsibilities relative to all the stuff that Chris is talking about. Evaluating at the same time that they're getting hit in the portal and they're looking at the portal. They got to keep their eyes on high school kids and where are they. So that becomes much more difficult at that level, at the FCS level. It's a difficult thing, and I think again takes a really good AD to manage how that's set up within their own organizations.
I think at that level, it's retention, retention, retention. And whether that's not necessarily a GM, but that athletic director, hopefully, is a student athlete athletic director. We talked about relationships that has a great relationship with a lot of the athletes in all the sports. It's basketball and football coaches sharing ideas, and volleyball coaches sharing ideas to try to keep your student athletes there. A lot of kids don't want to leave, but sometimes they get their hand forced because of an extra 20,000, 40,000. If it's an extra 500,000, it's hard not to say I wish you well. But when it's an extra 20 or 30,000 and stuff, maybe the relationships and the fact that you will be able to call that your alma mater, because that's where I think the bad thing is. We're in 15 years, there's only going to be 20% of a roster that's going to be there for all 4 years. And I just hate to think that. And I'm hoping that, at the Division II, I was a Division III coach at one time, the FCS, that they can keep their guys there with retention, but it's going to take a collaborative effort from everybody on that campus.
Yeah, I'm thinking about their resumes when they started applying for jobs and they've gone to 4 different colleges. And,
Yeah.
people who don't know college sports well are thinking, wait, what, you went to 4 different colleges?
I think that hurts them when you look at the NFL too, for some of them, not for
Yeah.
all of them, but like you couldn't stick. Why? Well, I got more money, or I wasn't playing. I mean, you wait and see at the combine and stuff. And I'll be interested to talk to some of the people that I know that are going to the combine of what kind of questions get asked when you're on your 3rd school or you're on your 4th school, and the whys, because they're going to dig on that. Because I promise you, when they come to our school and we have a really good kid that transferred in as a good player, and we had some of them that transferred in that made it in the NFL and are having a good career, but they ask, why did he leave so and so this school? Was he? Did you have any problems with him when he got here? I mean, they want to uncover everything because of the investment they're making in those people. So you're right. That's a question they're all going to have to answer.
Yeah, and I talk about this all the time, and I suspect you guys agree with me, but with the advent of the portal and the ability to transfer as many times as you want to, what are the lessons we're teaching our kids these days? I mean, about toughness, and yeah, if you get crossways with your coach today, I'm jumping in the portal tomorrow, and those kind of lessons. I'm not sure the educational piece and the rest of our lives are good building blocks for that. They just aren't.
Got a question on social media when we were advertising this about football staff size. And I said I would try to get us to it before we ended today. And this person had pulled gone on, each school's website and essentially counted the number of football staff members and was asking why it varies so much. So I pulled a few numbers just so we could talk about them. So in the Big Ten, the staff size varied from 101, which was at Rutgers, by the way, down to 38. In the SEC, the range was 46 to 80. In the Mountain West, it was 20 to 47. And they just want to know, why do football staff sizes vary so much? Chris, you're maybe the obvious one to handle this one first.
Yeah, I think one of it is resources and what your athletic director is going to continue to add, because it's costing money and stuff. Some of it is not everybody list everybody that they have on there. Some list everybody that's a part of it. You could have unpaid interns and stuff, because we had some, but I don't remember listing those people on the website. But maybe some people talk about that and add that. Maybe that's a recruiting pitch to say, you got 101 people that are going to work with you. So I think some of it is just the resources that people have and how many people that they are really putting out on the website. Because I know there were some people working with football that weren't on our website, that were interns or student trainers and student equipment, but they were doing stuff for us, student managers. So I think it's just every school is going to be a little bit different.
Okay, last question I've got here in our Q&A, and if anybody wants us to grab anything before we go, if you can get that dropped in. The last one I have here kind of goes back to the org chart discussion we had earlier, and we kind of danced around this but didn't hit on it specifically. And they brought up the Stanford example again, where at Stanford, the GM is above the head coach on the org chart. When that happened, it kind of made news. And then I think some Cal donors wrote a letter and said, well, it should look like that at Cal too. And it kind of started this discussion about who should be over who. What do we all think about that?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one. Here's the challenge: is in today's world of rev share, NIL dollars, and we talked before we came on to the group on this, is what is the coach really judged on? Because you can be the best coach in the world, and if you're going into, a sword fight with a butter knife, it's going to be hard to be competitive. And you don't have to have the most money, but if you are not participating in at a high level in the rev share and NIL game, it's going to be hard to have a winning season, much less give yourself the opportunity to compete for a CFP spot or anything else. And if the GM has control over that, hopefully the athletic director has the oversight and is looking at the whole thing. But if the GM has control over the amount of dollars that are spent, then again, I'd say the tail is wagging the dog. If the buck stops for wins and losses and the overall operation of the football program, then I do not see a scenario, no offense to Stanford or Cal, I don't see a scenario where you can hold that head football coach accountable if he's not the one making all the decisions that impact the football program.
Amen to that, John. Because the GM's not going to the press conference.
That's
You
right.
know, he's not going to the Monday press. He's not going to the radio show. He's not doing all those things. And if it's going to stay a college model, and I know they're trying to move towards NFL and stuff, if it stays a college model, the athletic director needs to hire his football coach, and then the football coach needs to hire the GM. Maybe have some dialogue with the AD to say, this is what I'm looking for a GM. But I think it still should go AD, head football coach, GM.
Christy, can I ask the last question?
Yeah.
Because I'm interested in what Chris's thoughts are, and we haven't talked about this. But Chris, give us your analysis of Indiana's success this year. And, you're reading about the fact that they did it with 3-star athletes and not 5 stars.
Yeah.
What's your analysis there?
Well, a good friend of mine that used to be on my staff at North Dakota State's the D-line coach, so I was excited for Indiana. I was excited for Kurt Signetti because he was at JMU in the FCS days. I missed him at North Dakota State, or time didn't cross paths, but had a lot of respect for somebody that goes and doesn't start on third base. He started by getting a walk and then working his way up. And the only thing that I would say is he brought a bunch of guys with him. I don't know how many from JMU that had a chip on their shoulder, that always thought that they could play big time football. When we were at North Dakota State, we thought we could play with anybody in the country. And we had those opportunities on certain occasions. Those kids at JMU went to Indiana saying, we can play with anybody in the country, and we're going to build that culture. And then they added guys to it, but they had it around that JMU/Indiana culture. And so I was excited. I was really excited for them to have the success they had. It also, I see this happening with hires now. You look at a group of 5 or an FCS where you could bring that coach and bring a good chunk of that roster. That's going to start happening more and more now.
Yep.
All right. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us live today. We appreciate it. And we'll have this replay available too if you maybe joined us midway through and want to start back from the beginning. Thank you so much, Jeff, John, and Chris, for joining and being so, open about this and sharing your experiences. I learned some new things. I hope everybody else did too. And we try to do about one of these a month. So keep an eye out, and we will announce one for next month, probably here soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks.